And we're recording, right, excellent. Okay, everyone, thanks for joining and welcome to the 2020 APAC Groundbreakers virtual tour by APAC OEC, which this year is the biggest one of these events we've ever run. It's something like over 170 sessions with presentations, workshops and labs, 123 speakers over like 11 days and 4 languages even, which is a first for us. So do remember to register to as many sessions as you can. All of the sessions will be available to replay as many times as you want for 2 weeks after your initial session date and time. And on the actual session page on the Hay Summit website, where you booked your schedule and everything, you can interact with the speaker. There's a Q&A section there as well, so questions and comments and things. That's better. So I'd just like to thank our all the Oracle user groups and Java user groups that made this event possible, and also our sponsors, the Oracle Groundbreakers and CloudDB. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the session, who is Jim Czuprynski. I think I got that right.
Perfect, perfect.
Good, thank you. Who is going to talk about Politics Ain't Beanbag, using APAC's ML and GeoCoding in a modern election campaign, which is, if you're in the US, is very topical right at the moment. And I'm in New Zealand, we've just had our elections, so it looks very interesting. Please feel free to write questions at any time into the Q&A tab of the Zoom webinar, and we can answer those at the end of the session. If there are any issues during the presentation, you can contact me during the chat using the chat tab on the Zoom webinar. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Jim to give us this really interesting looking presentation. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Nigel. Good to be here today. There we go. That's what we're going to talk about in just a second. My actual application. Well, good to talk with everyone in that side of the world where it's ready tomorrow. It's about 10 p.m. Central Daylight Time here today. And I was just chatting with Nigel. He's in New Zealand and Dunedin, and he's coming into summer and we're leaving summer. We actually had a little bit of snow on Sunday. So, but enough about where I am. Let me tell you a little bit more about my presentation today and a little bit more about myself. I have a few slides you may remember from yesterday, excuse me, that I'm going to focus in on, because really when we start talking about Apex and some of the things we can do with it, we're crossing so many different boundaries. Just a smidge more about myself. I've been in IT for 4 decades, finishing my 40th year this year. Officially, I started in 1981 as essentially a data entry clerk who started learning how to do mainframe computer programming through essentially like an in-company internship. Very amazing, and I immediately fell in love with it. Around 20 years ago, I shifted my emphasis towards becoming an Oracle DBA and spent 5 years in the trenches, 7 if you count the overtime, learning the documentation and learning much more about the database than I ever thought I would. I also spent about 7 years as an Oracle University instructor. There is no such thing as Oracle University, but I was an instructor for several of the Oracle core database classes. And over that time, I taught something like 2,200 Oracle DBAs, everything from here's how you do a backup, all the way up to here's how you do performance tuning in rack. Right now, I'm spending most of my time, I'm not actively working projects at this point in time, sort of 3/4 retired, if you will, or actually enjoying my life. But I do spend a lot of my time volunteering, and I still spend a lot of my time with dirt under my fingernails from a technical perspective. Right now, I'm also working a lot with OD Tug, which is a large, one of the larger Oracle user groups here in the United States and North America. We have an event coming up in June, KSCOP 21, hopefully in Nashville, pending COVID. And I also am the editor of Techceleration, which is our database community-centric storytelling, if you will, user case storytelling part of our portal. If you have some articles you'd like to contribute, feel free to reach out to me. Here's my contact information. And, perhaps you could submit an article on just about anything related to Oracle database. But enough about that. What does the title of my presentation mean? If you have not been to the United States, and more specifically, not to my fine city of Chicago, Illinois, this is actually where I grew up, Chicago. And that's our city flag. It has 4 stars on it. A little bit more on that history in a minute. But the title, first off, is really referring to something we call Beanbag, a game. This is actually my nephew, David, my grandnephew, I should say. I'm much older than I sound. Some places in the United States, we call this cornhole. But as you can see, David is throwing a beanbag. It's a cloth bag filled with beans. And the idea is you try to get it in the hole. And if you're playing in non-COVID land, he would actually have, his opponent would be throwing one at his set of beanbag holes, basically, right? So beanbag's a kind of a kid's game. It's a fun game. There's not even really any keeping score, just, learning how to throw the bag, right? And it's fun, but you know what? Politics ain't beanbag. And the guy that actually said this is this gentleman, Finley Peter Dunn. He had a character that he wrote for the Chicago Tribune called Mr. Dooley. And Mr. Dooley was an Irish immigrant, and he had a bit of a thick accent. And he said during one of his presentations, because in the 1900s through the 1920s, the Irish Americans really were in depth in politics in Chicago. And his statement is, politics is a tough game. It ain't beanbag. And what was interesting is that statement was one of the favorites of our first African-American mayor, a gentleman named Harold Washington. It only took Harold Washington, actually the entire city, which was essentially founded in 1830. It only took 150 years for us to get our first African-American mayor. And by the way, the stars on the flag have an interesting historical significance. The first star is the founding of Fort Dearborn. The second represents the fire of 1871, called the Great Fire, where most of the city was destroyed. The third, the Columbian Exposition. And finally, the fourth, the Chicago World's Fair in 1933, called the Century of Progress, right? It was celebrating the founding, essentially, of the city in 100 years of progress. The irony of this flag is that this man, Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable, who was an African-American, was actually the founder of Chicago. It took 150 years for us to actually get our first African-American mayor. And that proves to you that politics ain't beanbag. It's a tough business. It's also a fascinating topic, and one I'm going to be spending some time on because I've been working on an election campaign here in the US. It's a sane race. It's not a presidential campaign. It's a local congressional campaign, and I'll fill in the details here. But one of the things I really love, and you may recognize this if you attended my session yesterday on AI and ML, right, and OML and OAAC and all this other stuff, is that in my mind, the autonomous database environment that I'm going to be running my application in today, it's an ATP instance actually, is really going to be at the heart of where we're going in the future. Application Express, and I'm going to demonstrate this today, makes it really simple to draw data from just about everywhere. Heck, you can take an application and essentially import it, if it's an Excel spreadsheet, directly into Apex. And even better, you don't have to be an expert DBA to interface with tables, because ORDS, Oracle REST Data Services, has a REST interface with an API that lets you essentially make HTTPS calls directly to access or even change data inside your database tables. And finally, why are we so concentrating on this? Because we're digitally driven. If you're not digitally driven, you're going to be out of a career pretty soon. And if you want to become a professional, you need to understand that where everything is really going is, whether it's edge computing, or whether it's online transaction processing, or even data warehousing, we are becoming a digitally driven organization. And if you're an Oracle DBA today and you're still acting as if you can just hide in your room and wait for people to come to talk to you, you're going to be in an interesting place. Because if you see what I like to call DBA 4.0 is really the main focus here. Data scientists are running the show. If they're the miners or the pumpers out of data, the new oil, then we are the roustabouts. We are the people that, that's what we call them here in the United States, right? A roustabout is somebody that, he's the person, or she, the person that is out in the oil field driving the pipes down into the ground, actively searching, driving down, looking for that oil, right? And like General McAuliffe here, he was the guy, if you heard my little talk yesterday, at Bastogne, when the German army had surrounded the American army, the 101st Airborne. He was the commander, and the Germans said, we don't want to kill you, please surrender. And he said nuts, because he didn't swear. Being an American, I would use a different word, but back in the day, he didn't use that kind of language. He also told his troops, we now have the enemy exactly where we want them. We can attack in any direction. And if you're a DBA today, whether you're a core or an apps DBA or an application developer using Apex, you are uniquely positioned to attack any business case in any given direction, especially with this concept of the converged database. Have you heard that? That's been coming up a lot in Oracle discussions, right? By the way, there's no way to order converged database, okay? It's not a line item on your bill of materials. You can't order it, right? It's a concept. It's a concept. And the idea is we can get data from anywhere, whether it's an enterprise app, a REST-enabled table, an API, I'm going to show you some examples of that today, or a simple Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet or a CSV file or an external file sitting over in a Hadoop cluster, for all I know. Draw it into my database, or since I can use external tables with organization external, leave the thing where it's at, bring the code to the data. That's the idea. And I can use Oracle Machine Learning, Apex, and as I discussed in yesterday's presentation, Oracle Analytics Cloud, or OAC, to drive that digital transformation, becoming digitally driven as an organization. And this is not going away, my friends, and it's not going to slow down. So let me give you a real world use case. Now, unfortunately, when I first talked about using Apex with the US congressional campaign here, if you know the United States, there's a state called Illinois. We joke that, we put the Annoy in Illinois, right? People in Chicago, which is right next to our beautiful lake, we tend to be a little bit obnoxious, right? Remember, politics ain't beanbag. But we really love the game of politics, right? And really, when you get down to it, politics is simply the expression of governance. And I find political science fascinating. First off, I got a minor in it for a degree that only took 42 years to achieve. Not kidding. Seriously, started in 1975, finished in 2018. I didn't give up, though. When I first proposed some of these things, and I've done a precursor presentation for this, for an application I called VEVO, vote early, vote often. By the way, that phrase has been associated with Chicago for a long time because of a gentleman named Al Capone, who was a gangster, notorious gangster in the 1920s, during the Roaring 20s. That actually had a purpose. When immigrants, including my grandfather, who came to the United States from Poland, first came to the United States, basically, immigrants were told, vote early, because your vote might be challenged. If you've been following the United States news, yeah, there's a lot of concerns that voters are going to have their ballots challenged. Okay. And they also meant vote often. What vote often meant in every election. It is severely disturbing to me that my fellow citizens of the United States don't vote as frequently as they should. Okay. What we're seeing, by the way, in the 2020 campaign right now, across every state that has early voting, the numbers are through the roof. People are coming early to vote. They are motivated like I have never seen since maybe the 1970s. It's amazing. So how do you get people to the polls, especially in a campaign? You need to stay organized. You need to constantly monitor your progress. And humans being what we are, we need to know who we report to. Where am I in the hierarchy? Who do I tell this to? Or who do I, compel to do certain things? And finally, I need to figure out who I'm talking to and where they live. So when we first started this campaign for the U.S. Illinois 6th District for Congress, for the House of Representatives, we had barely 4 months to pull some things together. Unfortunately, no one really took my advice and didn't listen to what we could have built. They had very primitive technology, and we only, as I said, about 4 months to pull this together. But what I built for them and demonstrated for them was a simple way to look up a voter. By the way, one of the things work here in the United States is that when you vote in a primary, depends on which state you're in, we know which party you declared your, I don't want to say allegiance, but your affiliation with. We have no idea if you walk in the ballot box, if you declare yourself as a Republican, whether you actually voted, right, for the strongest candidate or recommended candidate. And in general elections, there's no declaration of intent, only in primaries. But we were able to figure out whether or not a person was affiliated or not with, say, a Democrat or a Republican orientation, right? There's actually a term for it called, I call it flippability. Oh gosh, the term has escaped me. I'm sorry, it's 10:30 at night here. I'm still trying to remember it. But it's basically the flexibility of a voter, right? Whether or not they can be swayed to possibly vote for your party's candidate or even just your candidate. But I was able to build very, very quickly a set of windows, right? Essentially a set of panels that have voters here. And this is simulated data. These are not real people. I would not share real voter data here. That's private, right? But how many times this person, Marcus Czuprynski, has been contacted by the campaign? Not a big deal, right? Basically very simple. It's kind of a parent-child relationship. I built these screens in less than a weekend. If I had been trying to do something like this in Power Builder, it would have probably taken me the better part of a week. I was able to do this once I understood what I wanted and I had my tables built in less than 2 hours with about 5 mouse clicks. Now, again, I had to do a little bit of reading and I had to understand what I was doing, and I didn't get it perfect the first time, but I was able to build these screens very, very quickly. Another one that I mentioned, right, is, hey, people want to know who they work for, who they need to report to. When something goes wrong, who to blame, who to report, right? So I built a little set of screens. Basically, we have 3 different layers. We've got, let me take that back, just one. We've got campaign organizers at the very top. And then we've got committee leads at the very top. And then we have reporting to them, campaign organizers. And then finally, we've got volunteers that report to the campaign organizers. So what I basically got here is a tree view, and I'm going to share that with you live. This is my application right here, live. This is my Apex application. And you can see exactly here, I've got Mr. Barnes, who has Ms. Champion reporting to him, and then who has several different people reporting to her. These are the volunteers. If I click on this particular volunteer, right, I can actually get a little report that says, hey, this person canvassed, talked to 8,000 plus voters, and here's how Mr. Anderson's response rate was. How many volunteers were interested in contributing? 80% of the time, roughly, somebody was interested in contributing. If I go back to that, however, I just want to go back to my screen here where I have the organization, by the way. And if I open that up again, at another level, I can actually see, well, Ms. Priscilla Champion here, well, she's got 3 folks reporting to her, And here's their average ratings. And overall, for the people that are reporting to her, here are the total cumulative number of canvassed voters within periods, right? Within monthly periods. And obviously, as you're probably aware, our elections generally fall on the first Tuesday of November. So obviously these people were just going crazy in the month of October, right? As you can see, they gradually increased their frequency of what they were actually attempting to do. And then finally, let me go back to that main screen one more time. If I just drill into Mr. Barnes, I can see who his campaign organizers, how they're doing, right? And you can see that overall, we've got several thousand, tens of thousands of voter canvassing activities actually happening. So again, not that crucial to really understand the in-depth aspect of this, but the thing I really want to highlight here is I built this as a simple tree view. The most complex part of this was figuring out how to use Apex URL to actually create the different URLs to drill into each one of these levels. That was the hardest part. This took literally about 4 hours, of which probably 2 hours was looking at examples and reading the documentation. This is not a trivial little panel to build, including those other smaller panels that have graphs and reports on them. But that's the beauty of this, right? I was able to build this in Apex in, again, everything I've showed you so far in about a weekend. Now, did they actually use my stuff? Never said they did. Unfortunately, they never really listened to me. And as a result, we never really got a chance to implement this, but it was a great use case, right? Now, another thing that happened, my wife was quite active in the campaign as well. At that point, she was retired. And so she really got involved in campaigning. She was actually an election judge for the past 6 elections. Quite interesting, some of the things she's telling me about. By the way, here's another thing about voting in the United States. Let me tell you, it's impossible, literally impossible, if someone has voted by mail to then walk into a polling place and vote. We know if someone has requested a voter voting by mail. So all the chatter you might have been hearing in the news about, oh yeah, there's going to be fake ballots and yada, yada, yada from one particular presidential candidate is just bunkum. It's not true. But in the role as a canvasser, I talked to my wife and she said, yeah. So we went out in the field and I said, well, how did you actually go ahead and access voter information? She said, on paper. I said, it was raining, honey. How did you actually mark people off? She said, it wasn't easy. I had an umbrella in one hand and a clipboard in another. And I'm like, oh, dude, we need to build an application. And I actually built a mini application in about a weekend. Now, again, my database tables already existed, right? Let me actually, whoops, I don't know why that didn't come up. Let me, I don't actually have it here right now. I don't think I copied that particular application screen in, but I was able to build it. Oh, sorry, let me go back to this. I was able to build it within a weekend, right? And in fact, I can demo that real quickly for you. I'll go ahead and open that application up because I've got them right here. Let me just share that with you real quickly. Here's my little mobile application. And let me run it for you real quickly in Apex. Hopefully I won't have to log back in or anything. And of course I will. It happens, doesn't it? Here's my login real quickly. Let me just do that. I love using these applications to keep passwords. One of the really neat things about Apex is this. If I want to see how this application looks, and whoops, something incorrectly, in a mobile screen, let me get out of that mode. I did that not quite correctly. If I want to see how this would look, well, I guess I did do it the right way. Don't do it that often. If I do a Control-Shift-I, which will let me see the application in a different way, that should take me to the right spot. There we go. I can change, I'll close this up here. Gosh darn it. Let me try that again. I'm sorry. I can actually see the application, I'll drag that down, in several different formats. So right now I'm actually looking at this as if it was an iPhone. I can actually pull it up into my Pixel. I run a Google Pixel phone. I can actually see how my app is going to run in pixel mode and what? Huh. Okay, well, that's never happened before. Anyway, let me just share that part with you. I'm a little unclear as to why that's not exactly working. It should be working fine. Perhaps I'm missing one little piece of data. Let me get out of this mode real quickly and go back to normal mode. There we go. And let's see how this is working. Oh my goodness. Okay. My app's not working 100%. Okay. Well, sorry. I was hoping to demonstrate that for you. But to make a short story long, what I was able to do was pull together a mobile version of this application in an extremely brief period of time and was able to deploy it. This is what happens when you work live, folks, without a net. Things don't always work perfectly. And I was able to deploy it in a very brief period of time. I actually do have a video of that somewhere I could share with you of exactly how that works. But let me get back to my presentation. Again, live. I actually was able to build the application out in a weekend. But what happened? I needed to start dealing with reality. My campaign organizers for the 2020 campaign had said, I need to do several different things. I need to be able to, and this is something that's relatively new in the United States, merchandise. It's a really great way of getting people to make a little bit of an extra contribution for a campaign. And so the folks came back to me and said, well, one of the things I'd really like to be able to do is capture requests. And I'm like, well, that's great. I'll build an app. Oh, no. You don't need to do that. I've got an Excel spreadsheet with all the information, all the requests. And I'm like, oh, God. Okay, great. Excel? Yeah, how are you sending that around? Oh, via email. Oh, God, it's not even secure. And that's what I really love about using Apex, right? Because we're sitting on top, in this case, of an ATP instance. It's perfectly secure. The data at rest is perfectly secure. I'm not worried about it, right? Because it gets encrypted inside an autonomous database. There's no way to turn encryption off. So I actually built this great little screen that said, okay, great. Give me your Excel spreadsheet. And you know what? I can load data. And you can see I've got several different requests here for different types of merchandise. In fact, let me share that with you live. I've got that guy right here under my merchandising tab. And I'm going to take a look at merchandising requests. And here's the file that I just shared with you. What was really cool about this is, and by the way, where I got this from, there's a sample data loading application that you can incorporate into your Apex applications and pull stuff out of it. I didn't write this completely from scratch. I could have, but the ability to, and this is one of the things I really liked about it, because one of the things they said to me is, by the way, in our congressional district for our volunteers, it's so big because we have almost 280,000 registered voters. We had to split it up into 8 different regions. So by the way, that Excel spreadsheet has different tabs on it. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's okay. I saw something in the data loading sample application, and I could literally click on a different region. Let's see how this is working today. Whoops, let me try that again. Let me open that file again and pick via preview. Here's the data for region 4. Okay, my nav is off a little bit on this. I think I made a minor change when I was experimenting earlier today. This is very much a work in progress for me. I'm still learning a lot about all the techniques with Apex, right? But the point of it is that I was able to take an Excel spreadsheet with multiple tabs and pull data off of it. And now if I clicked on upload, which I won't do because I've already loaded this data so I could show you some cool stuff, I was able to load data directly into my Oracle database, right? In my ATP instance. Back to my slides for a minute. So I was able to accomplish this from an external source, right? I didn't have to do anything special to load that. The technology is already there inside Apex. But the next step was, well, that's great, Jim. We've got all the orders. What we need to figure out next is where everybody is, because we need to set up a delivery schedule. And I said, well, that's great. That means we're going to need to know latitude and longitude. I'm like, oh, we don't know how to do that. Well, we could do it from an Excel spreadsheet. Whoa. We just made the transition from Excel. I can handle it. So what I actually built was a web source module, because what I was looking for was a reasonably priced method to do geocoding, geolocation as it's called, right? So if I've got an address, as you can see, if I go back one slide here, right? We have all these addresses. Well, where is this person? By the way, these are not real names, just so you know, in case somebody knows Angela Mitt. That's not her. These are not real names. But if I needed to go to this actual address to deliver something, I need to know its latitude, longitude. So what I actually did was experiment with a couple of different methods. Well, why don't you just use Google Maps? If you've got a developer Google Maps account, did you know you start getting charged after you start making more than a few simple requests for geocoding? So I needed to come up with another method. So when I actually experimented with, don't laugh, MapQuest. MapQuest actually has a API that you can call one by one to get geocoding results. And this is the guts of it, something called a web source module, right? So I defined a web source module. I'm not going to go into detail here because I've got an article that explains it in greater detail that basically said, hey, except in a location, which was just simply a string, comma delimited address. So street, number and name, city, state, and postal code, and return to me the latitude and longitude of that location. Oh, and tell me what side of the street it was on, and also how accurate is it? And so here I'm actually using the MapQuest API to do it, and then cycling through all return variables, right? Again, because there would be a possibility there could be more than one piece of information returned if I had incomplete address information. And finally, returning the data. And here's what's interesting. You may have noticed that there was a different address in here if I shared it with you. No, maybe I didn't. Okay. But the address that I show you here is actually down the street from me. In fact, it doesn't really exist. My actual address, just in case you'd like to send me a Christmas card or a gift, is 318 Pebble Beach Lane, Bartlett, Illinois, 60103. 359 does not exist. Interestingly, MapQuest came back with a latitude and longitude. But notice the quality code. If this was perfect, it would start with a E. It starts with an L. I'm not sure exactly why they picked L, but it does actually tell me that it's on the right-hand side of the street if I was facing north. And I know this is right because the way we work in the US is usually even numbers are on one side and odd numbers are on the other side. And 359 would be across the street from me on the right-hand side of the street. This quality code actually tells me, yeah, that street exists, that town, that state, that zip code does. If this did exist, it would be right about here. If it really did exist, it actually would be quite a bit down the street from me, farther down the street in essentially a neighbor's backyard. So the beautiful thing is it basically says, yeah, this isn't perfect, but it's pretty close. But again, it's only going to return a single set of values. Well, I found another geolocation service, and this one will let me request 2,500 requests in one day through a service called GeoCode.io, geocode.io. And I'll see that actual declaration here in a minute. Here's the trick. MapQuest lets me do a GET request. GeoCode.io needs a POST request when I'm using its API. So unfortunately, I had to go do some other interesting things. I needed to send in a JSON document with specific containers and specific strings that would let me send in multiple sets of addresses, up to 2,500 per day. I could make them all in one request, presuming that the lob that I was submitting, I submitted the data as a CLOB actually, right? A formatted JSON document. As long as it was small enough to fit within that CLOB, everything would be fine. So what I actually did is gather the data from a particular, I don't have the document here, the cursor, but the cursor basically just accessed a table inside my database, and I wrote out a unique identifier for the voter that had requested the merchandise, and their formatted address, built it inside this loop as a lob, actually a clob, and then submitted it. And here's the actual call. Notice that I'm using a JSON document format to submit it as a post request. Here's the actual code. Notice I have submitted an API key. Almost every single one of these APIs requires some sort of validation, right? That you're who you say you are. And by the way, here's a link to the article. I have it a little bit later in here as well that actually shows you exactly how to write additional code to do this. The key point here is I was able to pull back approximately 2,500 addresses per day, right? And we were getting around, at some point, 750 to 1,000 requests per day, so I knew I was in the ballpark. So what's my point? The point is I didn't have to use Google Maps API to do this. I found another source. And remember what I said. This is the new world, the Converged database. Bring the code to the data. Access a microservice, or in this case, an API that allows me to do things with a good degree of accuracy. And again, my article goes into great detail on exactly how I set up that web source module and exactly how to format data for it. And here's where things get interesting. Let me show you in the actual application. So I showed you a little bit about accessing and drawing in the data, right? Here's the result. Check this out. Whoops. Pending merchandise requests. There we go. These are a series of merchandise requests mapped on Google Maps. But I thought you said you didn't want to use Google Maps. For display, it's just fine. Would I use it for routing? Build a route using Google Maps? No, that also costs money. Well, how about directions? That also costs money. There are other services, and I highlight several of them in my article series, that would allow me to do exactly this. Well, wait a minute. What is this? This is a Google Maps? Yeah, it's a plugin. Jeffrey Kemp wrote a series of Google Map plugins that lets me see and operate this as an iframe within my Apex application. Did you know you could do this? Because you can. It's really awesome. And by the way, each one of these little points represents a particular latitude and longitude, and actually an address. The green ones are for requests for large campaign signs, right? People like to put campaign signs in their lawns. And somewhere in the United States, people like to steal lawn signs as well. It's a little bit of sophomoric activity, but that's about as nasty as our elections really gotten so far. There's plenty of time for it to get more interesting. The red ones are smaller requests, if I remember, smaller sign requests, and the rest of these are requests for various types of merchandise, right? Why would I care about this? Because I have volunteers out in the field. And I need to figure out eventually, how am I going to route, say, a team of 5 volunteers in my area? And by the way, this is a small section of what our election district actually covers. But if I've got 5 volunteers, I don't want to send one volunteer handling 80 requests here to try to satisfy them. I want to split them up. I'm going to be writing about this more in the future, about using routing and directions. And I'm not going to do it with Google Maps. There are other methods that we can actually use. But I just want to share with you how utterly cool Apex is for answering some of these questions, right? Again, if I've got an application that's already handling everything from canvassing detail for my applications, right? And looking at particular people inside my groups, or running a report that shows exactly how many different precincts have actually had voters that have been contacted, all the way through to my campaign organization, which is working just fine. Why not simply add in information about merchandise requests, right? And routing and mapping. And again, this is just for merchandise requests. What about finding where a particular group of voters may live, right? Is there a cluster within, say, ethnicity or whatever it might be, within income level, education level? By the way, that seems to be something that's factoring up quite heavily in our upcoming election, is the relative education level of voters seems to be determining at a presidential election level who they're voting for. It's quite interesting how that's all playing. Anyway, that's a little bit of a sotto voce off-topic discussion. Back to this for a minute. I showed you a little bit more about it. So here's Jeff Kemp's plugins. By the way, Jeff went to work for Oracle about 2 months ago, but he did release an upgrade to this particular Google Maps plugin. I haven't incorporated it yet. I wanted to keep this application static so it matched my presentation, but that's definitely something worth taking a look at. And finally, if you don't like Google Maps at all, did you know about this? This is an example from what's called the Geolocation Showcase. Let me share that with you because I think I actually did incorporate that in here somewhere. If I didn't, no, let me actually show it from inside my application area here. This is really neat. The sample geolocation showcase. Let me just run this application real quickly for you. I'll have to log in, of course. Just take a matter of seconds. Yes, I accept the licensing agreements. You may or may not know this, folks, but this is what's really cool. A lot of the things that already exist inside Google Maps, you can also do with the geolocation features of Oracle. So for example, if I want to actually see where I am on a map, here I am. There it is. And I can zoom in here if I want to and drill in deeper and deeper and actually see more information about a particular location, right? By the way, note this little button here, GeoCode. Now, you got to look at the licensing agreements, and there are some restrictions, but there essentially is a much lower bar for geolocation and geocoding using the Oracle geolocation services than there is for Google Maps APIs. So it's something worth experimenting with if you're thinking about doing that. Back to my presentation here. Yeah, you can actually go ahead and do geocoding. And by the way, there are some features that are coming, I understand, from talking with Hans Biemann and a couple of other folks, Karsten Sarsky. There are some other opportunities and features planned for later releases of Apex, right? I don't know where Jeffrey Kemp's going to take his Google Maps API with that, since he now works for Oracle, but they're going to take advantage, I hope, of all of Jeffrey's skills now that he works for them and actually ramp this up. And in fact, this to me is one of the most fascinating things, right? Because if you don't know where someone is, whether they're a voter or a customer, how are you going to get a salesperson out to them? How are you going to get a delivery to them? How are you going to be able to tell them where the closest store to them is? Or what possible route they could take to get to your store? So this is going to become more and more important, you know, as time goes on. So I'm actually going to be doing several presentations coming up in 2021 that's going to focus specifically on all the geolocation as well as the spatial features of Oracle database, right? Because there is some awesome stuff that you can do. And again, the idea here is once I've got a latitude and longitude, and even better, an elevation, I can almost do three-dimensional modeling in all kinds of different dimensions, right? Some really neat stuff you can do. I've got a short link here, by the way, if you want to take a look more at the cloud marketplace listing here for doing geolocation, right? Take a look at this because there's some really neat stuff there. And with that, I'm basically finished and it's time for me to listen to your questions. I do want to point out, by the way, I did write 2 articles of a 4-part article series, and of course you'll be getting these slides, right, for accessing Apex for machine learning and mapping and geolocation, right? One last thing on machine learning, by the way, I showed you this a little bit yesterday, but let me go back to my application here, my VEVO app, and just share this with you. I actually built a analysis of the flippable voters that I mentioned, right? I'm not sharing with you the results of which voters are flippable here. What I'm sharing with you is results from machine learning that actually show the accuracy of the model within, in this case, 50 quantiles, including a detailed report. Now, if you're not a data scientist, you probably could care less about this. That's not the point. The point is, one, I can change this quantile distribution and rerun my model. This will take about 15 seconds. By the way, this is accessing about 75,000 voters and actually training a model within now 30 quantiles. I actually just rebuilt a machine learning model, including the training and then evaluation of the results of it for what we call cumulative lift. Why am I sharing this with you? Because if you're doing machine learning and you don't like the OML Zeppelin notebook interface, and you don't want to pay the licensing fees for OAC, but you know how to write some code like PL SQL and SQL inside Apex, you can do this, right? And again, underneath the covers, what was this thing doing? If I actually show you the code for this, when I click run model, all it did was take in the variable that I selected from that quantiles dropdown box and said, please rebuild the machine learning model using those attributes. So I did want to at least touch on that a little bit, right? I shared a little bit with this with you yesterday, and I believe we recorded that session. So if you want to take a little bit more of a look at that, that's a great place to look at it. But the last two articles in this series, and my time is up, that was my timer, are right here that get into extreme detail on how to do everything that I showed with you here. I also recorded a few 2-minute tech tips about 2 months back on using geolocation, spatial, and graph features. And I've also got some links here for the Apex sample geolocation features, right? And Jeffrey Kemp's Google Maps plugins. And again, like I said, I believe Jeffrey has a new set of these available, right? I think he's on version 3. I think I was running with version 2. Anyway, that's pretty much it for right now. I'm going to stop. I'm going to see if we have any questions. Okay. Anybody want to pop a question at me? Hopefully I wasn't too confusing at this time of the day.
So I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A tab, but one thing I noticed, you were saying that there was like 4 months to build something useful, and that it struck me every time I've heard about election sort of software systems of any sort in the US, it seems to be like this incredibly compressed time frame. Would you say that's fairly typical?
Great question. I'll give you the US perspective. It depends on which political party. The Republican Party in the United States is extremely organized. They have what I would like to say, a small tent. Okay, they have a few core issues. I won't get into the political aspect of that, but they only have a few core issues, and by and large their voter base is pretty focused on getting their person elected. The Democratic Party, and by the way, the candidate I worked for here was a Democrat, right? And the congressional district here in the United States had been held by a Republican for 35 years. So for this guy to make an impact, very interesting dude. I've met him 3 or 4 times. He was actually he has a master's degree in microbiology, if I remember correctly, and he owned several environmental engineering companies, right? So he was doing things with like biomass engineering and truly clean energy, right? And things like that. He had a couple of businesses, he sold them, and he's around maybe 45, 50 years old, and he sold them to get into politics, because he was tired of what he had seen, and he was really very frustrated about science not being listened to, okay? We can all make our assumptions about how well that worked in the past 9 months here. Anyway, so the gentleman named Sean Casten is an example of the kind of person that we're starting to see in the Democratic Party. We're starting to see some really interesting people with a business background, not so much politicians or even ex-military. We would typically see folks like that in either party. What's interesting is this time around, in 2020, there's a lot more enthusiasm, and also there's a lot more organization. So I was just reading an article online, someone from the Democratic Party doing something that would be considered anathema, which is, we're not going to lose all this stuff again, because she was actually saying every 2 years, the Democrats rebuild their entire voting infrastructure, right? The Republicans don't have that problem. They're much more organized, right? And it's not because they're the party of business or anything else like that. They're just a much smaller tent, right? To close on that, by the way, there's an old story that one of our comedians said many, many years ago in the 1930s. And he said, "I'm not a member of an organized political party. I'm a Democrat." And man, that is so true. It's funny, but because there are so many different competing ideologies inside the party, in a good way, in a very good way, it's a much more, a larger tent, if you will, right? It's much harder to get people to do things in a concise fashion. So pulling things together in 4 months and trying to convince people, the biggest challenge I had in 2018 was nobody wanted to take data out of base systems because they were afraid about security. All right. And I'm like, but it's inside an autonomous database. It's secure. Well, we don't trust that. Well, show me where you have your data right now. Well, it's on this server in the basement of the campaign office. And I'm like, are you serious? Are you kidding me? What kind of antivirus is on there? Oh, I don't know. Oh my God. So it depends, right? It really depends on the party and their willingness to get organized. But this time around, I'm not kidding you. I mean, I've been observing politics here in the US for at least 45 years, since Nixon, okay? And I have not seen Democrats in this country as motivated, but also as organized, right? In my lifetime. And it's scary that it's that organized. So yeah, basically it's every 2 years they were re-engineering the wheel. And this time around, they're like, hey, there's this thing called GitHub. Maybe we should put our code out there. Yes. So it's an interesting use case, it has been. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. And, I had a couple blips there I'm not too happy about, but, again, this is going to be recorded, right? And if people have any questions and want to get back to me, you've got my contact information. I can share that with you again in case anyone's interested. Let me just zoom back up to the top of that. Where am I here? And hopefully you didn't, there we go. Hopefully you didn't find my Chicago history lesson too boring, but it's a fascinating area, politics, I find. I think that, as I like to joke, the most powerful weapon that Western civilization has ever developed is actually two-pronged. It's government and lawyers. And it's really interesting. Nothing scares people in the U.S. like a lawyer. It's just, you can throw anything else at them, but a lawyer, So it's interesting observing it. I am very optimistic about where the world's going. Forget elections, but when you look at what we're doing with Apex today, and you look at what we're doing with the Oracle database and how resilient our community is, it's room for optimism, in my opinion. But anyway, that's me.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
It was fascinating, actually. And,
great.
Thank you to everyone else who attended. Don't forget to register to other sessions in the conference. There's plenty of them still to come. We're only halfway through the first week. And as I said at the start, we have the question and comment section on the Hey Summit page for each session, and you can interact with the speakers there as well. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you, Jim.
You're very welcome. And everybody stay safe, stay well, and we'll talk to you later.
Excellent.
Good night.
Good night.